loud. Welcome to Breathlab, everybody.
Hello.
Dan Brulé, sound off.
Well, welcome everybody. Great to be here.
Outstanding. The OG, the man himself. Casper Vandermeulen, you there? Sound off.
Mr. Vandermeulen, I'm in the house.
Vandermeulen it is. This is Jill Miller.
Good morning from Los Angeles.
Good morning and welcome. Peter Litchfield.
Hi there, Peter Litchfield here in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Outstanding. And Miss Pamela Gold, co-hostess with the mostest. What's up, girl?
Good morning. Everything's great.
Great. And Mr. BMAC, Brian McKenzie himself. How are you, brother?
I'm here. I am well. Thank you for the link, Jill Miller.
My pleasure, Brian.
Outstanding.
Like I said, Jewish mother.
Breath secretary. That's what you can call me.
Yes.
Breath secretary. So here's what we're going to do, folks. We're going to sit down and we're going to discuss the topics that maybe aren't being discussed in any other place or any other forum. It's a no-nonsense place for us to have dynamic discussion around what's happening, shifts in consciousness, growth shifts in the human race, the science behind the function of breath. This is an open mind share. It's just a forum for anyone who's interested in a breath-inclusive lifestyle. What does that mean? Well, technically, we believe, all of us, that better breathing makes for better humans, and better humans might just make for a better humanity. So I want to go ahead and get us started today. I'm joined by none other than Dan Brulé, the world's foremost breath master, author of Just Breathe, breathmastery.com's head honcho, and teacher to more than 140,000 people worldwide in the last 45 years. He's the leader of the worldwide spiritual breathing movement. Dan has studied breath work with the world's leading spiritual and cultural luminaries and teaches Tony Robbins, Commander Mark Divine, and me. Dr. Peter Litchfield, School of Applied Breathing Sciences. Areas of expertise include behavioral medicine, behavioral psychology, applied psychophysiology, research design, behavioral pharmacology, placebo effects, biological learning and motivation, physiological education, and capnography. Man's extremely qualified. He's also the inventor of the Capno Trainer, a game-changing functional breath assessment and corrective system. There's no one more qualified here today to talk science about breath than this man. And there's Brian McKenzie. Mr. Brian McKenzie, this man, if they're elite, he has in fact coached them from big weight to ultra endurance athletes, Hollywood moguls, and elite military units. This man has taught them to use their breath to excel in life and on the field. He's co-authored the books Power, Speed, Endurance, and the New York Times bestseller Unbreakable Runner. Good personal mentor, breath brother and friend, Brian McKenzie. Next guest, Casper Vandermeulen, world-class breath and biohacking pioneer, former Wim Hof lead instructor, high school science teacher, seasoned professional musician, stage performer, and author of Mind Lift, Mental Fitness for the Modern Mind. I always say it's the work that you do before you get to breath that makes you an amazing breath worker. And this guy's got all the bases covered. I'm a huge fan. Just met him. From beginner to mastermind, Casper has something for everyone. If you're looking into breath and biohacking, Casper is a phenomenal person to look for. And last but not least, the belle of the ball, Jill Miller, has a bio too long and prestigious to even begin with, but let's just start with 30 years of pioneering in movement, yoga, breath work, and training over 500 teachers worldwide to use her tools and methods. She also created 2 seminal fitness formats, Yoga Tune-Up and The Role Model. She has a best-selling book by that same name and dozens of DVDs. Jill designs mobility programs for large fitness companies, professional sport teams, and has been featured on just about every media outlet you can think of. Please help me welcome, this is Jill Miller.
Thank you.
Thank you all. So here we are. Today we're going to have one discussion, starting with people who know nothing, everyone, panelists, people who know nothing. Assuming that there's no knowledge, we're going to discuss the inhale. And so I've asked each of you to prepare a rough minute-long statement about what the inhale means to you personally and professionally. And then we're going to walk it from the most basic beginner thing all the way to the most advanced breath ninja stuff. We have 55 minutes roughly to go. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. Jill, I'd like to start with you. Would you give us a minute of inhale and then we'll just take it from there?
I was totally hoping you wouldn't, but I'm happy to open the breath bubble here. So said simply, your inhale breath exposes your stress state. The inhale is this constant test that you can look to that immediately exposes which zone of respiration, that's some of my lingo, which zone of respiration you're currently in the moment, or whether this is a zone that you tend to live in chronically. You can influence your inhale by modulating your sympathetic or parasympathetic inputs. And that can be either by choice or by being in your body's implicit reactions to whatever it is within your internal or external environment. The other part about the inhale, and I think I'm still under a minute, is that your inhale is the necessary dose of energy that your body is mapping out for a phrase of anticipatory performance. And maybe we can unpack that. But the inhale is the necessary dose of energy that your body is mapping out for a phrase of anticipatory performance.
Okay, that's incredible. The necessary dose of energy. I like it. Speaking of energy, Dan, what do you got on the inhale?
Well, well, I mean, inhale is naturally a contraction, right? So we used to say when we breathe in, our diaphragm contracts, but it's probably more accurate to say that when the diaphragm contracts, we breathe in. But I look at inhale and it's either conscious or unconscious. You know, it's either active or passive. It's either reflexive or deliberate. We're either riding the inhale or, you know, driving it, right, or guiding it. I like to play with the difference between pulling the breath in and making space for it. Soaking up the breath rather than sucking it in. A powerful inhale happens when it's primed by a good exhale, right? So if I'm very, very empty, I squeeze everything out. There's an inhale reflex just waiting to occur when I stop squeezing. I love that feeling. And then, so a good inhale is primed by a good exhale, you could say, the reflexive inhale. And then we kind of look at all of the qualities that people express with their inhales. Are they gasping, gulping? Are they sipping it? Is it a streaming experience? Are they savoring the inhale? Are they postponing the inhale? Are they prolonging the inhale? And these days, it's really good to talk about inhaling because, man, what's happening with the corona craziness is people are afraid, literally afraid of what's in the air. And people are being prepped to be afraid to breathe around other people. The whole masks and social distancing, humans are social animals. So I don't know how long we can keep that up or play that game of dividing us even more. Now when breath is supposed to be the thing that connects everybody, and now it's becoming the fear. So anyway, so those are my thoughts as we enter this conversation.
Thank you, Dan. Casper.
Mute myself.
There you go.
So from a coaching perspective, I would say like or from a breath, like kind of like self-mastery perspective, the inhale is like the first opportunity to get a feel for where your state is. And as Jill wonderfully put it, it's like your first measurement of where you are in the sympathetic, parasympathetic spectrum and what you can do to kind of self-regulate within that spectrum. So that's how I practically work with it most of the time. At the same time, I'm also a bit of a word nerd, and I love how the word inspire, inspire, that's the French word for inhale. Inhale is the first, you start life on an inhale. And there's many new things in life that you start on an inhale. So on a more like broad spectrum, almost like spiritual view, that idea that the word inspiration means to breathe in, but it also means to be in spirit. And that also, if you look at the human system and how it functions, if you see somebody take an inhale, and this is kind of like a trick that I do to get people in on breath work, and I ask them to take one inhale and based on, and an exhale, of course, but I take a big breath and they breathe in. And by the time they're halfway through the inhale, I can almost tell them what keeps them up at night. And then they're like, "It's magic. I want to learn breathing from you." And it's just a beautiful way to see if to inspire is to be in spirit. The inhale shows us in what kind of spirit somebody is walking around with, right? So it allows us, it's this grand opportunity for self-regulation, to become aware of the inhale and the exhale, but let's focusing on the inhale, and to understand which parts of your body are moving, how are you articulating the breath, as Dan so beautifully put. But I always like to come back to that concept of inspiration, to be in spirit. It's the first thing you do at the start of your life, and also the first thing you do at the start of every new opportunity to stand in your life in a new way.
100%. Thank you very much. Mr. McKenzie.
This is good stuff. I like what Casper just said, because we talk about this a lot, in that to inspire is to bring it in, and to expire is to bring it out, right? And expire alluding to expiration or death, right? I think the inhale is very predictive of, pun intended, or ironically speaking, of the predictive system that actually, Jill was alluding to with energy. And we live in a predictive system, meaning what we draw in goes on a prediction system through the arteries as we bring it in through the system. And so the brain actually plays a role in this, and how our emotional context is set up and how we use that. And in jumping on to everybody else's themes here, it's what's actually going on inside the human is what this inspiration or inspire, this is what's telling us so much. And this is what we'll see from a movement or mechanical standpoint in somebody's ability to actually use their diaphragm, which is all about inhaling. And that inevitably brings us to how we're going to use this energy that we want to use. And that tells the story of what's going to happen with life, I think, and how we're bringing that air into the system is telling me what's going on, right? What's going on with the person, how they're compensating, or how they're moving around things, and this is with, a lot of what we do. But the fact is most of what we're doing is unconscious. And so being wired up in specific emotional states and how we are, the predictive system falls into this pattern through the brain and how it is working with or pulmonary ventilation, I should say. So our inspiration here, and I think that's pretty important to really look at from our perspective.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Peter.
For me, the inhale is about bringing the fundamental physiology of respiration together with the psychology of breathing in a very, very important way. First of all, breathing is obviously regulated by fundamental reflexes delivered by the brainstem. That is chemical considerations in the arterial system, that is oxygen concentration, carbon dioxide concentration, and the pH of the blood. That's an important input to those brainstem mechanisms. And then there's the CO2 concentration in the cerebral spinal fluid, along with the carbon dioxide concentration in the cerebral spinal fluid. And those factors together bring about action on the part of respiratory centers in the brainstem that will regulate breathing, for example, through the diaphragm. Now that's very fundamental, very chemical, very physiological. But on the other hand, the inhale is driven psychologically in a very, very important way. And you really can't understand the inhale unless you look at both the physiology and the psychology. The psychological part of it has to do with trust. And it's not only trust in your own physiological system, but it's a metaphor for trusting people and trusting what life is about. So that if you can get into the feeling, which has been, I think was mentioned by Dan before, the feeling of that reflex that takes place between the exhale and the inhale, and you can discover it, and you can feel that it really is going to happen, and that you can trust your body, then the inhale becomes not something you do, but it's something that happens. It's a part of who you are. It becomes gentle. It's not a struggle. It's activating. You feel alive when it happens, and you trust it. And then that becomes a metaphor for the way you live your life, that inhale. And we focus on that a lot in our work, about people learning to trust and then being able to move that to other places in their lives. That said, that's where I come from when I think of the inhale, both professionally and personally.
That's outstanding. Thank you, each of you. So what I'm hearing here, before I give it to you, Pamela, and ask you about your experience with the inhale and where you'd like to go with this, is inhale is a bit of an assessment tool. For those of you who are just listening, there's a lot of neurochemistry, biophysiology, biomechanics that's involved in what we're saying. But what the panelists, I think, are saying is some commonalities here is you can get into the inhale from a psychological perspective, from a spiritual perspective, and a physiological perspective. And none of those is woo. And I believe that they're all entwined. And that's why we're having Breathlab now and moving forward. Because how do we justify, rationalize, and come to some heartfelt consensus on science, spirituality, and physiology for the evolution, mindful evolution and control of our own physiology and development? Pam?
Yeah, I think of the inhale as kind of the authentic confidence. So if we use the word trust, we use the word preparedness. And it's cool because in my own journey, I can identify where there's dysfunction there that maybe I'm not conscious of. And so then the practice of improving is authentic. So I'd love Jill to talk about that in her own practice. I know the mobility work that she does, bringing the physiology with kind of the spiritual. I'd love to hear.
Sure. So first of all, I do want to say something to Peter, because Peter, I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I didn't know that you lived there. And so not only am I completely geeking out on everything you're saying, but I want to go offline and talk about how things are there. One of the reasons one of the reasons I got into a love of breath work has to do with why we moved to Santa Fe, Peter, which is that my mother has chronic asthma. She became asthmatic at age when she was 13, and she just was so ill so frequently. I mean, I was woken up many times as a young child by the sound of sirens at the house, taking mom to the hospital. And when I was 7, and after she had divorced my father, and she got remarried, they decided to move to Santa Fe because they had heard, and this is in 1978, that high altitude living, and Santa Fe in particular, was very good for asthmatics. So I got to grow up above, way high up in the United States, and got very interested in really the why that we moved there. So anyway, I'm super moved by you, and that took me into a little bit of a personal story. But it continues to motivate me to this day because my mother is still asthmatic, and the first time my mother palpated her diaphragm was in watching me on a broadcast actually show people how to palpate their costal margin. My mother was 68 years old before she even started to learn about the anatomy of respiration. And really, this is where I start. I start by coaching people into palpation and pressure-based experiences so that they become familiar with their zones of respiration, where they tend to live. And do they have the facility to play their wind instrument? Can they translate the location of the respiration from, let's call it zone 1, which I say is abdominal breathing, right, which is dominant. Zone 2 is that rib cage breathing, a more sympathetic type of breath that we need for sport and activity. And then zone 3 is that, in case of emergency respiration, the stuff that happens above the collarbones. And so helping people to locate their tension patterns, their unconscious tension patterns, and unwind them by using, I have a variety of, of massage balls that are part of my repertoire and education system, to give people the biofeedback of where they're holding unconscious tension, because those unconscious tensions become the pump for where you're living in your breath pattern. So you can imagine my mother, the asthmatic, this is the shape of her, and this is sort of how she gets a lot of her breaths in. She doesn't study with me on the regular. Occasionally I've gotten her to class. She gets very sick. She's passed out before. And when I say sick and passed out, I don't mean like, throwing up, but she starts to feel very dizzy. She's not used to a parasympathetic breath pattern. She's used to living in a very high sympathetic stress state. When you bring people who are in a chronic sympathetic stress state, start to bring them lower and lower, their physiology kicks back at them, and they start to feel what they've been running from or this whole time. So it's ideal to be able to pendulate those experiences for those people. So I think I just sped through a lot of things. Is that what you were asking me, Pamela?
Yes, that was perfect.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
Awesome. Thank you. Dan, Pam, do you mind if I ask Dan? Dan, here's the thing. You teach relaxation. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. You teach relaxation, and yet you provoke shamelessly the sympathetic nervous system on the inhale. Now, Mackenzie focuses on the exhale, a long, slow, smooth, maybe ujjayi exhale. But we're going to get into exhale next topic, and I'm going to let him run wild. Can you please tell me why on earth you would teach relaxation, and it's a loaded question, and activate the hell out of my sympathetic nervous system the first time we did breathe together? What gives with the inhale activating the sympathetic nervous system, and how does that work with contradictory attempts to relax while doing it?
Well, I know, we're familiar with the idea that when you inhale, you activate the sympathetic branch, and exhale, you activate the parasympathetic. And that always kind of bothered me. Why should we, just because we're breathing in, be activating the fight or flight mechanism? Mouth breathing is also part of that kind of question, that people say, when you breathe through the mouth, you activate the sympathetic branch of the nervous system, the stress response, people are uncomfortable, their throat gets dry, and I always thought, well, why should that happen just because you're breathing through your mouth? Maybe there's something you need to heal. If every time you breathe through your mouth you trigger this fight or flight mechanism, maybe that doesn't have to happen. And when you actively play with the inhale and you do conscious, I come originally from the rebirthing movement, let's say in the teacher part, where we were inspiration oriented. We were inviting more life. We're using the breath as a transformational tool to trigger stuff and all that. So I think the difference is between what is your unconscious habit and what do you do as a deliberate exercise, and so but I like to insert a question in all this, that when somebody breathes in consciously, are they literally contracting their diaphragm, or are they pushing their diaphragm around with other muscles? And so I think the game of breathing or inhaling and how it's kind of settled with me is in this how I kind of understand it or describe it. When I choose to breathe a certain way, when I choose to inhale a certain speed or volume and so on, and the way I'm choosing to breathe in is exactly how my body would have me breathe in that moment, I have just consciously linked to my intuition. I have just consciously merged with my nature. The way I am choosing to breathe is exactly how nature and my body would have me breathe in that moment. And when I'm in that dance, there's a feeling of being in a flow. There's a feeling of being energized without any effort. And it's a felt sense, so it's kind of hard to talk about, but when a person has the experience, then they kind of get it. So, you know, it's kind of like, or I could relate it to playing pool, right? I was a pool player, billiard player. And some people's stroke is so graceful, so elegant, so effortless. And yet, boom, the power they have on that stroke. While other people seem to really like muscle the cue and try to push it, and they don't get anywhere. And I guess you could say the same thing about a golf swing. You know, some people swing at a golf ball like they're swinging at a baseball bat, and the ball goes nowhere. And other people have such grace and such elegance and such effortless in their swing. And the ball goes a mile and it looks like they're not exerting any effort at all. So that's the game that I like to play when I encourage people to breathe actively, when inhale actively. I'm trying to get them to feel their way into breathing how their body wants to breathe and become a partner in that, or even a master of it. So my question is hidden in there, and I was thinking of Peter and maybe others, you know, who really, you know, when we inhale consciously, are we contracting our diaphragm, or are we just pushing the diaphragm around with abdominal muscles, or are we just using chest muscles when you breathe consciously, or can you actually control the diaphragm? So that's, I mean, questions that I'd like to have percolate around and see where we land.
Sage?
Well, yeah, go ahead,
Peter.
Peter.
I make a comment.
Would you please?
You know, when I think of the sympathetic nervous system, I don't think of fight, flight. That becomes, it's an important consideration, but it's just part of what it's about. The autonomic nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system, is about arousal. It isn't necessarily about fight, flight. It's about arousal. And arousal is very positive as well as negative. It depends upon the meaning of it. Your heart beats fast when you're, you know, in a place of distress often, and it beats fast when you're excited and happy. So it's such an important thing to understand the parasympathetic function in a comprehensive way, because historically there's so much emphasis in the area of breathing put on relaxation and put on meditation and that kind of thing, when in reality breath has to do with the other end of the spectrum as well. See, my life has been personally, you know, I was not interested in breathing years and years ago because I always identified it with relaxation, which to me was personally not something of interest. I've been an adventurer most of my life. I spent 30 years traveling in the North Pole area, exploring up there. And then as I got involved in breathing, of course, I learned that it was much more than just relaxation and meditation in the more parasympathetic sense. I mean, you have meditation also in the more sympathetic sense, in the arousal sense, in the embracing the world sense, rather than in a defensive, protective kind of sense. So my interest personally in breathing is on that positive end of it. And of course, Dan was basically addressing that in his own way. And so I was keying into that as he was talking. And so I thought I'd like to just mention that to you as to where I come on the subject that he was discussing there. Thank you.
Absolutely. Fantastic. That's a very important thing. And I saw Brian nodding your head, and then Casper, I want to get to you. BMAC, you're like, absolutely, arousal is important. You just posted about this, and you guys at HHP are doing all kinds of stuff around this. Talk to me about how you train elite guys who run fast, burn hot, and go hard. And what do you do with the breath? Because we're talking about the inhale, sympathetic activation, and its value. What that means in everyday terms. Can you break that also down for the layperson who has no idea what we're talking about right now?
I can attempt.
Yeah, please.
I can attempt that. To piggyback here, you know, like, so I totally agree that we've kind of, and I'm kind of perpetuated this in some degree, because we talk about the inhale being sympathetic, and we talk about these responses, and people are in too high of a sympathetic state all the time. That's not the context of which the sympathetic nervous system works. We have to have the sympathetic nervous system has to be on. That's how you wake up in the morning. And so arousal is a very important thing. Hence why things like what Dan came from, rebirthing, and these were things that actually drove me into, or to explore breathwork more, because I had such it had such an impact on me. And these are inhale driven practices, right? That being said, the exhale is about, the inhale and exhale are about arousal. And so in the inhale, depending on the speed or what's happening, you're going to have psychological components that are driven off of that, right? Or emotional components that are driven off of that. And the exhale as well. And it becomes this play, right? Like if my exhale is longer and slower, of course, we're driving more of that parasympathetic tone, right? And that's context driven to a large degree. But on the inhale, if I'm fast, or if I'm, what is that? That's a high stress response. So these are those higher stress responses that we see with people in arousal states. And when you're dealing with people who like want to win, want points all the time, we have to be understanding in what it is we're trying to get to. And when we look at American athletics to a large degree, and we could look at a lot of different athletics, but if I were to compare, let's just say, the American endurance world to the African endurance world, what you will see is a very mid-range, high mid-range sympathetic activity type training. What you see with the African runners or the African training ideas is a very low parasympathetic training and very high sympathetic training, meaning when it's time to go hard, they go very, very hard. And then when it's over, they come off. And in America, or in many of the other countries, this is in a very mid-range activity where we're in this yellow area, right? And this is indicative culturally of what we do. We are at this mid-sympathetic range of activity where it's constantly talking, constantly on. I'm constantly having conversations with people like I'm doing right now. Then I'm going to go to another conversation. Then I'm going to go to another conversation. I'm going to close that deal. I'm going to do this deal. I'm going to do that. And then I can't wonder why I can't fucking sleep. Well, here's why. Because you're actually not able to get up real high. You're staying right here. And we're not oscillating the real rhythms. And so this is why so many people get affected by these big things like rebirthing or holotropic. And because we actually induce these very heavy doses of things that inevitably people respond to by dropping out, and then the breath relaxes. And if you've paid enough attention to breathing, you'll notice in any animal what happens when they finally fall asleep. The instant they fall asleep, that breath changes, and that breath then slows on the exhale and even pauses and stops. And then it naturally picks back up and follows into this, versus this, or what's a typical stress response? And then I fast in and I hold right away, right? And these have psychological, emotional components to them that we have created throughout our lives that follow them. And so none of us can hide from them. And it's not a bad thing, but it's understanding what this is. And this is why the world that I think we all exist in is so fascinating. Because we all start to see, holy crap, like if I can control the breathing, I change the way my arousal state happens, and I can fluctuate that depending on where and what I need to do. And so when I stop talking here, I've learned to shut my mouth and allow my breathing to kind of calm down. Anyway, there's my 2 cents on that.
I think Brian is right on. I think that was well stated. It's the flexibility, being able to move between those in the full range. And that's
I appreciate that, Peter.
That's where the freedom is. That's where the freedom is. And that's what we teach in the work that we do. Is fundamental to it is for people to be comfortable with the full range of what breathing's about and how it affects them. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Peter. Just to like throw this right out there, we just got a paper that just came in that got posted on the Health and Human Performance Foundation on emotions, people being able to regulate emotions based on breathing patterns and what are happening. And, it's so interesting because so many of us get so far off and we don't understand what that is. And that's the importance of what we can do with breathing, is that we can bring it back to understand how to modulate and how to work with that and where we want to be throughout that spectrum. And it's like, if I go into a high mid-range sympathetic place for some time, look at the animals. What are they doing after they do that? They pull back. They settle down. They curl up.
Too. They
Yeah,
shake
they
first.
shake
and then
and shiver.
well, yes, when it's a very life-threatening situation, yes, that does happen, and they deal with their trauma instantaneously, unlike us. But
let go. Yeah.
if it's just a simple, I got away from the lion today, I don't even need to shake it off. I just go back to eating grass and allowing my bowels and things to go back to working the way they were, instead of most of us walking around without our bowels working well, without our, being in these high stress states. And the reason I bring that up is because we think this is normal. It isn't normal. We live in a time where this is very unnormal. You should be pooping every day. All right.
Well, I'd like to add to that, Brian.
Yeah.
I like to add to that because what you're mentioning with the animals, for example, if these are automatic things that they do, that is, we develop habits, and that's what a lot of our work is about, habits. And so you want these things to be automatic. You don't want to have to think about it at that moment. You just do it. It's part of who you are, rather than what you essentially impose on yourself ultimately.
Getting back to our nature. This is the problem with the prefrontal cortex. The ability to critically think, to make very creative decisions and do things, comes with consequence. It's not a right or wrong. It's a consequence. This is how nature works. The consequence of creating emotional problems with things that don't actually exist or aren't really happening right now. And I'm trying to predict, or I'm focused on something in the past and not learning from it, right? And so then I get to intertwine it into my emotional experience of what my senses should just be doing for me.
Brian, can you actually post a link? There's a request in the chat box. Can you post a link to that HHP article? And I want to get to Casper quick. Casper, you've been very patient. And I know you deal with science and spirituality and physiology and the psychology, and you're a musician. And so you have a very unique perspective that we haven't heard from yet this episode. And I'd really like you to please take the mic and just run with this. Everything that you've heard, where are you at, and what do you?
It's been too much. I'm used to just like lecturing on this for hours, and now I'm just wiggling of excitement hearing everybody speak. It's really amazing. I think this full spectrum human experience view is often not very seen by people. And I think what is so eloquently expressed so far is that people get stuck in this mid bandwidth of there's not real sympathetic activation there. Like, people aren't going out and kicking ass and doing extremely interesting and adventurous and amazing stuff. People get stuck in this very narrow gray bandwidth within their human experience. So it actually happens very often that I have to teach people to do an actual sympathetic breath, which means that they also actually invite the emotional state that belongs to that breath. So one of the first emotions we get taught out of habitually, and this is why I love every time Peter Litchfield says habit, he points out the precise difference so beautifully between what is a physiological system that runs naturally and what is the layer on top of that is habit. For example, frustration or anger, what we would correlate with the fight state, if you look at it from a polyvagal perspective, a lot of people just don't go there, right? Until something triggers them so hard that they do go there, and then they get traumatized in that state, or they build up a lot of fear, or they learn, right? They learn a new habit of, I shouldn't go into anger and frustration. And instead of actually expressing or entering, I should say, embodying certain emotions, they lock up in the moment when they're supposed to show that emotion, again, proving that kind of psychological strategy in their life is not something they're supposed to do. So a lot of people get themselves away from anger, away from sadness, away from grief. And then when you open up, you kind of like rip apart the shackles on that bandwidth of experience through a very strong supraventilative practice, like has been discussed, then suddenly people have this mind-opening experiences where those suppressed problems actually express themselves, and then they get to live through them if they do it in a correct setting. So I think there's a very high necessity for teaching people to map out their states, their nervous system states, and to understand that every single thing that you can experience belongs on the spectrum of our human beingness, which means that there is a physiological, a biochemical, a nervous system, an emotional, and a spiritual layer to all of those. The question is, how can we give people tools that unlock these different parts? And sometimes that means instead of just teaching relaxation, because I see people who are addicted to relaxation. There's people who are addicted to their, with low respect to say, they're addicted to this namaste state. Like whenever intensity arises, they want to come back to the mat and do 2 hours of silent meditation. Now, sometimes you have to be like, listen up, this is me, this is my life. And so I teach people, like, sometimes in breathing workshops, I end up screaming in another guy's face until he screams back at me, and then they finally relearn to actually enter intensity. So I do a lot of weird shit around increasing intensity in breathing in my classes. Like, for example, people who are stuck in this not actually full breathing. So they're kind of like upper chest and kind of shoulder, but also the upper chest and the shoulders aren't properly moving, right? So I put a heavy sandbag, sometimes at their own body weight. So I would like have a 80-kilo sandbag on my chest and breathe into it. And at a certain point, if you can kind of override the habitual patterns of I shouldn't go there, you can get back into this full range, this full power, flexibility of inhale. And we're focusing on the inhale now. And I notice that especially teaching people under intensity to get a proper, like, powerful inhale, and with that also the expression of the loaded energy of the inhale on the exhale, which is another very important thing, right? So inhale is kind of like an activation. It's an opportunity for activation if you go there. Well, most people use that activation to keep them stuck in that same state that Brian was so beautifully talking about. And this is something that Brian and I became BFFs on years ago, this idea of parasympathetic activity under increasing intensity, where you get more of a co-activation of these branches. And it's not like this is on and this is off and this is right and this is wrong. It's about bringing it together in function, in a habit that you actually want to have, right? And another thing about the inhale, this is one of the most trippy things that I have ever done, and that I do fairly regularly nowadays, because I teach this breathwork masterclass where we do animal lung dissection. And this is actually almost like a very spiritual thing, to have a set of and we have sheep lungs, right? So we have actual lungs, fresh. And we then, as a part of that practicum, we actually blow air from our own lungs into the dead sheep lung. And some people can't really stomach it, but anyway, it's a pretty intense thing. So then you actually feel the amount of pressure that is needed to expand all of that space that is inside the alveoli. And what is interesting is that you can then become aware of how much that is an activation, right? And of course, it's a negative blowing up of the lungs, because in reality, you're expanding the chamber and then the lungs grow and the air comes in. But then you see this wonderful response as soon as you let go. So you've filled up these lungs with air. And as soon as you let go, there's this completely natural, and it's almost like a fractal psychedelic movement that you see, where you see all of these alveoli kind of relax again, which is, of course, because of as you breathe into those lungs, there's a loading of energy in the elastin. And as soon as you move away from it, it kind of deflates naturally again. And I think that is one of the most, like, it's very metaphorical also for the things that Brian just talked about, that we've all just been talking about, is that there's this difference between this conscious activation and a breath pattern that kind of naturally happens. And that natural, wonderful, beautifully happening movement pattern that looks so wonderfully relaxed. And, you know, if you watch your children sleep before they get habitualized out of good breathing, preconditioned children, so to say, or animals, right? Or your dog or your cat, whatever, you can see that wonderful, beautiful thing. And then we go like, oh, that is relaxed breathing. I should be doing that always. But no, actually, you get there after you've been to the other side of that, and then you come back there naturally. And the idea that humans are meant to be in this one state is, I think, one fundamental flawed paradigm of human being, where we get schooled out of anger and frustration and out of sadness and out of all these parts of our psychological spectrum of capacity that we get schooled out of. And I think in order to become a whole human, to live a wholehearted life, we need to enter into these different states. And I have found coaching people on, for example, a powerful or even aggressive inhale under the right circumstance is a very freeing experience, where they finally get to express energy that hasn't been allowed to express for a long time. And then on the creative part, I think, like you said, tying in music and things like that, I really love experimenting also from that perspective. If we do deeper breathing sessions, the kind of sounds I project into a room in the moment that an inhale is happening. So for example, if we're all doing a rhythmical breathing pattern, on the inhale, I'm giving completely different cues than on the exhale. So there's a very deep subtlety in your mental capacities within the inhale and the exhale, right? So if somebody's having a panic attack and they're going like this, in that moment when they're inhaling, their self-awareness is generally very low. It's very difficult for them to listen because they're in this more mobilized part. And then if you can start to lengthen the exhale, you can slowly become more susceptible to the human voice and stuff like that. So this opens up a really interesting kind of field that I'd love to talk to you more about as a musician later on, is to look at like the different stimuli and impulses that we can put into a human system as they are inhaling and seeing which match up. But anyway, I could geek out about this for hours, but I'll stop it there.
That was masterful. Thank you. And this is why I love Breathlab. What we've just covered, the span, and I want to get to Dan and Jill real quick. The span of what we're covering, if you're listening to this, you understand the guy I'm about to ask, 4.5 decades. Dan, you've been messing around with this multi-state thing, right? You hang out with the Russians who, as you said, punish each other with massive blunt force trauma and encourage each other to relax into it simultaneously. Brian's talked about it. Peter's talked about it. Casper's talked, Jill's talked about it. Everybody's talked about it. What have you discovered in 45 years that allows you to work with this multi-state arousal, relaxation, dance, the positive, negative polarity of breath, your whole thing, everything that was just said in one way or another has been formed up with your open and expand, relax, and let go?
Yeah, well, I've always thought that the principle to make sure that we're creating balance as we learn or study or practice or teach. So if I find a breathing exercise that I absolutely love and it feels wonderful and it gives me great benefits and everything, my question would be, what's the polar opposite technique of that? How would you describe or define the absolute opposite of what you feel or think is the best, the most wonderful way to breathe, and then practice that until you're equally comfortable with it. Because I see breathing as above and beyond all the what we're talking about, physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual. It's an evolutionary tool, or there's a potential for using it as an evolutionary tool. And if I am using breathing to kind of nudge my system to the next level of evolution, not wait another 1,000 years or so till humans grow up a little more, get into that game, I can expect that my system is going to complain when I'm nudging it out of what feels normal, the normal healthy parameters, the unarguable physiological parameters where we try to keep people in to maintain a stable state, to maintain a healthy current state. But what if you're using the breath as an evolutionary tool? You're deliberately trying to push your system to the next level. It's gonna seem like we're doing unnatural things in that process. There was a physiologist, a body-oriented anatomical expert I met in France years ago, beautiful woman, 50 years of teaching movement, body-oriented stuff. And when I described the breathing techniques that we were doing, and we compared that to how the body naturally wants to move when we're breathing, and I thought with all of her experience, she would use that as a piece of evidence that, well, see, what you're doing is so unnatural. But instead, what she said was, wow, maybe the system needs to catch up to new ways of breathing, right? It takes a while for the body to orient itself to new levels of energy, new states of being, and so on. And so, I respect what you call normal parameters and healthy biological limitations and so on, but part of me wants to push that envelope, and the whole aggressive, active, conscious breathing, inhale-oriented breath stuff, I think is geared towards that, well, for example, I tell people, well, you know, when you, diaphragmatic breathing is stabilizing. Chest breathing is activating. It's not a way to stabilize yourself on your current state level. If you want to move to a new level, you wouldn't practice diaphragmatic breathing. That's just going to anchor you and stabilize you more on the level you're at. And we're trying to cut the moorings and cut loose of the anchors and see where we fly to and where we land. It's a trust in something higher, let's say, than what I can measure and what science and even my past experience tells me is right and good and necessary and so on. So this whole aspect of an evolutionary tool kind of deliberately takes us out of all of this, what's right, what's wrong, how it should be, how it shouldn't be. And now we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants, but maybe that's how we land in a really new, amazing place.
Jill and Peter would love to hear a bit more from you guys to wrap this up based on everything you've heard. Jill, you know, I'm particularly like what Dan was just saying about evolution and the body's movement. I know that that's something that I followed your work, and I love how you are incorporating movement into this elevation of growth. And then Peter, if you can wrap up and talk more about the science side and have the two of you guys chat a little bit, I'd love to hear you guys connect.
We have such an incredible capacity to influence the tone, the behavior, and the range of motion of all of the myofascial structures that are a part of our respiratory system. In the contacting of tissues, you literally press into windows and doorways into your nervous system. And so this is a at your disposal avenue of discovery. This is your inner medicine chest. Like, this is the pharmacy within you. And I mean, my passion is giving people these survival tools so that they can learn to listen to their physiology. They can learn directly from their anatomy and uncover history, presence, and even the possibility of a different future. So, you know, I always end up going back to my family and my story, because both of my grandmothers died from emphysema. You know, my mother being an asthmatic, and my father is he's actually a frontline worker. He's an infectious disease doctor. I'm working with COVID right now, but you know, he believes in medicine, chemical medicine. And so I've had this battle for decades with him. I have these tools that don't leave any chemical side effects in the body. I'm not saying that my tools can cure COVID, but just the paradox of you know, I've learned, I've had to dig so deep into my work to be able to explain the anatomy and the physiology and the impacts that that it's having, the subjective stories of people who have gotten rid of the allostatic load from medications that were keeping them trapped in a body that was just spiraling in one direction, but able to sidestep a future that was going to potentially end in a different way. So I guess all this to say is that, you know, teaching people tools to be a better listener to their own body systems, and then ways of mobilizing and influencing themselves so that they really can alter the course of their life and their lifestyle. That is one of the main ways that I use and involve breath for people. And then there's just one thing I wanted to say to Casper, who in this screen is actually right here next to me, but I don't know where I am on your screen, Casper. But you know, I'm a trained performer as well. And a lot of the incredible breathing instruction and breathing lessons I learned came through formal training, through the discipline of singing and the discipline of dance. Not good instrumentalist, so I'm not good there, but also as an actress. And I just want to come back to the word inhale and back to one of my opening statements about this anticipatory, the body's anticipatory influx of energy for a given task. So this really is about preparation and about the anticipation of the output I'm going to need to complete a phrase, whether it's a phrase of music, whether it's a phrase of spoken word, or it's a dance phrase. All of these, which of course are all on exhale, but it's the body's anticipatory or practiced design of that output that is the inhale. And so there's been a lot of talk of, sympathetic, parasympathetic, which I love, but there's also this need for expressivity. And our inhalation gives us the tool and the medicine to dose out our expressivity so that we can connect and stay connected to our fellow beings.
Really well put. As an artist and a creative, I can't wait to have this conversation with the two of you offline. That'll be so much fun. Peter.
Yeah, I'd like to just make kind of a general statement based on what Dan talked about. He was talking about evolution. And what I'd like to just point out is that, see, my background is in the field of what we refer to as behavioral physiology. And so we think of physiology as being smart. It's just not about reflexes. It reconfigures itself all the time. In essence, it's always learning. It's always collecting information. It's organizing information. It's using information. And then you can look at epigenetics, for example, which is an up and coming area right now. And that programming and that reconfiguration that the body does all of the time has everything to do with what happens epigenetically. So when you look at evolution, you really have to look at the psychology that's embedded in it, the meaning that is embedded in the physiology, because that's how it operates. It all operates based on meaning, and it reconfigures itself based on that and becomes something new, something different. So it's evolving. So it's not just sort of going back to what the fundamentals are around reflexes. It's about moving beyond that and becoming a different organism. And the breathing is a great way for us to explore this, to explore our own physiology and how we influence our own physiology. And it becomes part of the evolution of not only who we are, but the evolution of life itself from the very beginning. So, from a general perspective, what we're doing in the area of breathing and the metaphor to which it speaks is just absolutely profound.
Mm. And on that beautiful note, I am going to thank all of my panelists, Casper Vandermerlen, Jill Miller, Brian McKenzie, Peter Litchfield, Dan Brule, my co-hostess with the mostest, Pam Gold. We're going to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to please go ahead and just tell people who are listening or watching now or in the future on YouTube where it is that they can find you, what you're doing, plug whatever's passionate in your life right now, what makes you excited, what you're working on. Start with Dan. We're going to go right across Dan, Casper, Jill, Brian, Peter, and then we will wrap this thing. Dan, what's going on, brother? What do you got?
This commercial time. Breathmastery.com. Thank you. Find breathmastery.com. And I'm on Facebook, Dan Brule Breath Mastery. It's easy to find. And Instagram, Dan Brule Official. But I just want to leave with this, talking about, if you think there's only one right way to breathe, namaste the fuck away from me.
Coming from the OG himself, head of the spiritual breathing movement. Namaste the fuck away. All right, breathmastery.com. Casper Vandermeulen, Mr. Mindlift, what do you got? Hit us with where we can find you. Oh, unmute you. Boom.
Fun to follow on Instagram. I'll post my handle here at Casper's Focus with random shits and giggles every single day. If you ever want to eat psychedelic mushrooms and blow into sheep lungs with me, you're welcome in the Netherlands at my breathwork masterclass. That's the shortest pitch that I can come up with.
Yes, dude. I love it.
Points I've ever heard. That's the best. I'm in. Where do I go?
Psilocybin and sheep lungs. That's the .com. But anyway, yeah, no, it's follow me on Instagram. That's I'll try to make sure you won't regret it. And I'm very grateful for this wonderful mind meld. I just want to say that because I've really been, I study and I work and I coach people, but it's very easy to get on an island. And then to have this in an hour, just feeling all the boundaries of my island, move in and work with all of you wonderful people has just been very spectacular. Just an amazing experience for me to be here and to talk at this level and at all these levels with people that are so as into it as I am. So it's very, very, very good tribe feeling. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you. Miss Jill Miller.
Mrs. Jill Miller. I'm a Mrs. I have 2 kids that are pounding on the door, wanting to play right now. All of this in the pandemic is so much, and my breath work is one of the things that definitely keeping me alive. So where you can find me is, my website is tuneupfitness.com. That's all one word, like you tune up a car, tuneupfitness.com. And I put a little link or whatever in the chat box of my Instagram handle, but I'm at Yoga Tuneup on Instagram, and I'm also doing 3 times a week live stream classes, which I've never done before, but the quarantine has definitely changed the way I'm producing media. And so every Friday is a breath and core tune-up. And so if you're interested, especially in diving into your anatomy with me and application practices that will take you into zones of respiration and self-massage, learning more about fascia and my approach to self-myofascial release, I put the link for the live stream classes there too. That's really the best way to understand what I'm talking about, is to embody your body along with the practices. So thank you so much for having me. It's just an absolute joy to listen to all of you. And I took a lot of notes, so I'm going to have to digest this a second time myself.
That was the coolest thing. Thank you, Jill. And I'll be joining you. I'm actually excited to kind of join up and to actually join up and be one of your students. I was looking at your Nowly class. I want to do that thing with my abs.
Yeah.
Do that with her abs, people. She can make her abs go left and right. They could do the wave. She can make it do in the center. I don't know. There's some really cool stuff. I don't know what's going on in there, but I'm all about it.
I explain it in full. Like it's not supernatural. It's actually just nerves and your tissues communicating. So get on it, people.
I'm about to join that whole bandwagon. Thank you so much, Jill Miller, for joining us. I look forward to having you on another Breath Lab. Brian McKenzie, what's up, dude?
So I put some stuff in the chat for Power Speed Endurance, where everything we have is. There's a free 1-month code for anybody who wants to get on that, where we have training, the breath work, the stuff that we do, we apply. The education and information that we're doing goes all there. So it's on there. Breathlab PSE is the code. My Instagram handle's on there. I can concur with Jill Miller and the Molly stuff. It took me a couple of years, but I finally figured it out. And it's a very cool thing to be able to do. That being said, it's a complete reset too. Like, I mean, if you would not believe that doing stuff like that could actually change some things, but it does change things. Nonetheless, appreciate this, appreciate everything everybody's here for, to learn. And just, I really appreciate everybody who's on today. Casper and I have spent lots of time together. Jill Miller and I even more time, and we've known each other for quite some time now, and I just keep enjoying Mr. Litchfield and Dan Brule, who are icons in this world, and I appreciate it. So thank you, Sage.
Thank you, Brian.
And
Peter.
And Pamela.
Yeah, and Pamela. Big time, Pam. Thank you, Pam. Peter, take us home.
Okay, I just put my email up. It's very simple. PL, my initials, Peter Litchfield, at B as in Bravo, P as in Papa, .edu. That's it, pl@bp.edu. You can reach me there. I'm involved in 3 different things. We founded quite a few years ago a graduate school where we've offered a master's degree in applied breathing sciences, and we have a certification program in doing breathing behavior analysis. And then that's my one hat. The second hat is a company I started 20 years ago where we manufacture a capnometer for looking at what we call the chemical axis of breath, which is really bringing together mechanics of breathing with the chemistry of respiration. And then the third thing we have is a telehealth or telebreathing service that we're actually opening now in Europe and in the Middle East, as well as in the United States, where we have a whole number of people who've been trained who then can provide services to people who are suffering with dysfunctional kinds of breathing habits. That's what I'm up to. And you can reach me, as I say, at pl@bp.edu. And Sage, I want to thank you and Pam and everybody. I really appreciate it so much to have the opportunity to interact with you and to share some of my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. We love you. Pam, why don't you take us home too? Talk to us. What's going on? What do you got going on? What's transitioning? What are you doing in your life? And where can people find you?
Well, you can still find me on Instagram. Hacked Fitness is still a thing, even though we closed our New York City studio this week. So it was a big week for me. Lots of breathing. So Hacked is going to continue on, and my personal is Pamela P. Gold. But super grateful for all of the teachings here today. You guys are all really inspirational, and super grateful. Sage, you're awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. So this is Breathlab. This is what we're going to be doing every month, once a month. I think next month we're going to do the new Jack panel. These are all the people doing breathwork 5, 7, 8 years or less who are up and coming, who have studied with every one of these people or some of these people on the panel now. We're going to take a look at the new faces, the fresh faces of breathwork. We're going to maybe start a sparring match, see what happens with the new faces, the fresh faces. We're going to discuss the topic of exhale next time. And then we'll be back each month, month to month, and we're going to look at how we can expand this, how we can continue to promote each and every one of you who are doing amazing things and have a common consensus around these divergent topics in breathwork so that the rest of the world who's wondering what we're doing can actually see what it is that we're doing and how they can apply it in their lives. Thank you to my panelists. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Casper. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Brian, Pam, Peter Litchfield. Thank you, every one of you. Your time is precious. I appreciate you spending a little more than an hour of it with us. We'll see you next month. This will be uploaded to YouTube in the next few days. Have a beautiful, beautiful day, all of you. Cheers.